Now that you're done post-processing your images, it's a good time to back them up. And this is one critical step that you should never omit from your photography workflow. Now, we briefly mentioned backup before in this video, but we didn't go into too much detail. And it's a good time now to revisit the topic and explain its importance. Now, we use the word simplify to describe a photography workflow to make sure that you actually get in the habit of doing it rather than not doing it at all. But in this particular case, simplifying it too much can lead to a lot of trouble. For example, you do not want to simplify your workflow to the level where you only have a single backup. Because if you lose your primary storage and your single backup, then you could lose some or perhaps even all of your life's work. So then you might ask, well, what is enough? What is the proper way to do backups? And our recommendation is to follow the 3-2-1 backup rule. Basically, the 3-2-1 backup rule is broken into 3 different components. The first one, number 3, indicates that you need to have 3 copies of your work. Number 2 indicates that it needs to be stored in 2 different media types. And the last one, number 1, means that it has to be 1 copy off-site. Now let's get into this a little bit more detail. What does 3 copies literally mean? 3 copies could be 1 production copy where you're actually sitting and editing through those images, and wherever you're storing those images is your primary storage. That's number 1. The second storage could be a backup of what you're working on. Now remember, we said RAID is never a backup. So if you have 2 hard drives and they're working together and they're both mirrored, if you lose one hard drive, yes, you have the second copy, but that is not your copy. So make sure that the backup is separate from the primary storage where you're working on. So number 2, separate backup. The third one is basically a backup of a backup. So once again, 1, primary storage, 2nd, backup of the primary storage, and 3rd, backup of the backup. Now you might think that having primary storage, a backup of that storage, and then a backup of a backup is overkill, but the next 2 rules explain why this is important. The second rule says that there should be at least 2 different storage types, and that's very important. So remember, going back to that example where there's 2 hard drives and they're working together to mirror the data in RAID 1 configuration, we said before that RAID is never a backup. So in this particular case, those 2 drives are of the same storage type. They're internal hard drives, plus they're sitting in the same computer. Now imagine what would happen if your computer burned out, if there's a short circuit, maybe something else happened and you lost both of those drives. So you never want to put the primary storage together with the backup storage in the same place. Ideally, you want to keep it separate. Now, if you have a computer, you might have an external drive, for example, or maybe some other RAID array that's sitting outside. Those would qualify as different media type. In those environments, then, if anything happens to your computer, you have at least that backup, which is a proper backup of your primary storage in a different location away from your computer. Now, the last backup rule says that you need to have at least 1 backup off-site, and there's a good reason for that. Earlier, I said you need to avoid having a situation where your primary storage and your backup are in the same computer. And I gave the example of how if things short out or something happens and you lose both, then you don't want to lose both the primary storage and the backup at the same time. But what if you have your backup sitting on your table, or maybe it's in an array somewhere in your house, and your entire house burns and you lose everything? In those situations, you want to have at least 1 backup off-site. That way, if you do lose everything, maybe there's some natural disaster or something else that happens and you lose all of that, or maybe even something as simple as theft, so that you still have all of your work saved somewhere else. Almost any offsite storage location should work for your backups. For example, you could store your backup in your neighbor's house, in your relative's house, or someplace like a bank. As long as the storage conditions are right for the type of the media that you have, then you should have no problems. So to reiterate the 3-2-1 backup rule, you should have at least 3 copies of your data, preferably in 2 different storage types, and at least 1 of those backups should be stored off-site. Earlier I said you have primary storage and then you're backing up from that primary storage. It makes sense. However, if your primary storage gets damaged, for example, something happens to the files, remember you're backing up for the second backup and the third backup from the primary storage. That can become an issue. I had a case where I had a hard drive that failed, and then I was able to repair the hard drive. After I did that, I thought, well, what's the worst that can happen? I didn't want to copy all the files from my secondary backup because the secondary backup was external drive and it was very, very slow. So for me, I thought I'm just going to restore these files and everything is going to be fine. Well, I restored the files, and then shortly after, I realized that most of the files had zero data in them. So when I realized that, I came to a conclusion that if anything happens to your primary storage, a failure or some other problem, ideally you want to restore from the backup. Now, a backup can only be considered a backup after it was properly tested. If you have a backup of your data and you've never simulated a disaster situation and you were never able to properly recover all those files, that backup could be bad. So the most important thing you want to do, whether it's your main backup or your offsite backup, whichever is the case, you always want to test it. So far, I've talked about what to do not to lose data, but how do you actually back it up? And this can be quite overwhelming for someone who's never actually done this because there's so many different types of software and hardware out there to back up your data. Now, so far we taught you how to properly organize your images, and we did that for a reason. Remember, there's one main folder called Photos. The reason why we teach that is because if you have only one main folder called Photos and everything flows underneath, your backup could be as simple as dragging that folder from your primary storage from your computer into some external media, like a hard drive. And that really simplifies the entire backup process. Maybe you don't even need software. However, for those who want to more or less automate the process, there are solutions too. For example, there is specific software out there that you can install on your computer. As soon as you connect the external drive or it knows of the presence of the external drive, it automatically kicks off the backup procedure. And that can actually alleviate a lot of the pain associated with backups. Now, if you're willing to invest some money and time into this, you can actually completely simplify the process of backup so it becomes a painless exercise. For example, for me, I store all of my images in external storage. So I have a Synology box and it's a storage array where all of my photos are stored. And if I'm making changes to those images, I actually have another Synology box, which is a smaller device, but it's a backup of my primary storage. So in this case, my primary storage is not even residing on my computer, it's sitting on the network. And whenever I make changes or import images, I never have to worry about backup because what happens is that my box will automatically replicate all of that data from the primary storage into the second storage, which is another array in this case, automatically. There is no process for me to get involved. And you can even automate your offsite backup. As long as your offsite backup is connected to your network, and that could be over the internet or maybe through your local area connection, as in the case of your neighbor, you could set up a system where your data is automatically backed up to your offsite backup. Now, I just said that you could have your offsite backups done over the internet. And I'm sure by now you've heard of companies like Backblaze or Dropbox that provide such cloud solutions, where you have your own storage someplace on the internet in a data center. Now, the problem with this particular approach, and the reason why it doesn't work for me, is because the biggest bottleneck is the internet connection. Now, I work from home, so my permanent base is my house, where I have an ISP like Comcast, or you might have some other company that provides the internet service. They're all going to have a connection limit, and specifically your upload limit. In my case, it's only about 10 megabit. Now, if I try to upload my images, when I come back from a photo shoot, I might have gigabytes of data. Well, it's all raw files, remember? So if I try to upload those images to cloud solutions or the cloud storage, it's going to take forever. Another potential problem for many photographers out there who sign up for cloud storage is the initial backup. For a person like me, for example, where I have terabytes of data, it might take years for me to upload all the data to the cloud. So the good news is there are companies out there that actually provide help and assistance in this regard. What they do is they have you send all your data in a physical hard drive, and it could be multiple hard drives, and then what they do is they provide you all that service to do the initial backup. They basically copy everything from the provided drives into their storage and then send the drives back to you. That way, all of your future backups are basically taking place incrementally, which means that only the new files are getting uploaded. All of your existing files are already there. So even in this case where the company might provide help in doing that initial backup for you, you still need to make sure that your connection is fast enough so that you can rely on it in the future. If you come back from a photo shoot and you have gigabytes of data and that takes months to upload, well, guess what? You cannot rely on that solution as your offsite backup. To wrap up everything we've said so far about backup, first, make sure that you have a proper backup solution in place. You could never ignore backup because it's too important. The last thing you want to do is lose your work. Second, make sure that you follow the 3-2-1 backup rule, which ensures that you have multiple copies of your data stored in different locations. Third, until you actually test your backup and perform a disaster recovery procedure, you cannot call that a backup. Fourth, ensure that your primary storage is reliable enough to be used as the source of the backup. Fifth, if you have a lot of data and you're doing frequent backups, or perhaps you have no solution in place today, consider automating your backups. And lastly, if you do consider cloud storage as your potential offsite backup solution, do make sure that you have the proper infrastructure in place and your internet connection is fast enough to be able to keep up with those backups. There are a couple of other things that we need to add to this section, and one of them is backing up your images in your camera. Now, we talked about backing up images after you copy them from your memory card into your computer, but one of the things that you can do, if you have a semi-professional or professional camera, it might have an option to write to 2 cards. So in this case, I have a dual slot Nikon D750 here, and what it allows me to do is I have the option to go into the camera menu and select the type of writing I want to do for these 2 slots. So I have 2 memory cards inserted in here, and if I'm shooting something really important like a wedding, one of the worst things that can happen is one of these guys can fail. So as we said before, it's not the question of if it's going to fail, it's the question of when it's going to fail. So in this particular case, what I can do is I can actually have both of these memory cards inserted into my camera, and I can choose an option to do backup. And what will happen is if I'm taking a picture, as soon as I take that picture, it will write to both of these memory cards at the same time. So if I do have a situation where one of these memory cards fail, the second one still contains all the information that I need, all the images that I've captured during that time. Now, some photographers take additional precautions by storing these memory cards differently. For example, they'll take the first memory card and put it into one memory card storage bin, and then take the second one and put it in their pocket or some other place. That's just in case something happens. Maybe if their camera gear gets stolen, so that they still have that second memory card that they can always retrieve the images from. So keep this in mind, that you actually have other backup options that you can perform right in camera before you actually perform the backup after you transfer the images and you worked with them on your computer. Now let's talk about another important backup topic that many photographers unfortunately overlook. I'm gonna go ahead and set the camera here, and that is backing up Lightroom catalog itself. If you're a Lightroom user, you might not realize that the software creates a catalog, and that catalog essentially contains all the changes and everything you've done to the images in that catalog. And if you lose that catalog, you're gonna have to start over, especially for people who use the automated way to organize their images just using collections and keywords and other tools within Lightroom. This can be especially important because if you do lose your Lightroom catalog, you lose all of that work that you put in the first place. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my computer here, and I've got 2 places. So the first place is where I actually physically store my images. This obviously needs to be backed up because remember, Lightroom does not physically store any images. All the images in Lightroom are simple references, they're links. So the first thing that I need to worry about, obviously, is backing up the actual photos folder, which many of us do. However, a lot of people overlook the need to back up the catalog, as I stated earlier. So in my computer, I've got a D drive, and in my Lightroom folder, I've got all these subfolders, and they contain the actual catalogs. Now, these are the files that I need to back up as well. And if I don't do that, then I'm gonna have to potentially start over. Now, what do you actually back up here? And this is something important. Well, you've got a folder here, and then you've got a file. The file here is the actual catalog. This is pretty much the only thing that you need to worry about backing up. While it can be useful to also back up the previews folder, it's not necessary because you can regenerate all the previews for the images at any time in the future. But if you do lose this file, then you're in trouble. So you always want to make sure that when you do the backups, that you go through and make sure that you back up these images. Now, in this specific folder, I've got a couple of other files. There's Illercat, Lock, and Journal. And the reason why I have these is because I actually have that catalog opened up. So if I were to back up, I want to make sure that I close out of Lightroom so that the catalog gets properly saved, and then I back up this one file, 2015. So as you go through the process of backing up, make sure that you always back up two things. One is your actual Lightroom catalog, and two are the photos that you have in your computer. Now for me, there's one additional step that I personally like to do, especially towards the end of the year when I'm finalizing everything and making sure that everything is in sync, is also making sure that I'm saving all the changes that I made to the images to the files themselves. And the reason why I do that is because I want to make sure that no matter what happens with Lightroom, if I completely lose my catalogs, or maybe I lose several types of backups that I've got, as long as I can retain my images, that the images still contain the changes that I made in Lightroom to them. So let's go over that real quick. Right here on my computer, I've got the Lightroom catalog open, and it's 2015 with 32,000 images. At the end of the year, what I typically like doing is going to the parent folder, then selecting all the images, and then pressing Control S. You can do the same thing by going into metadata and hitting Save Metadata to Files. Now what this does is it forces Lightroom to go through each image and is going to write every single change that I made to that image into the image itself. Now you might be wondering, how does it happen? Does it actually modify my raw files? No, it doesn't, because if I have the original raw file and it's an NEF file, what it will do is it will actually take that NEF file and it will create something called a sidecar file. And that sidecar file is going to reside in my system along with that NEF file. If I go to metadata and then click on Save Metadata to File, it says metadata will be saved to sidecar files next to the original photo. So it's letting me know. And if I click Continue, what it just did, it just created an additional file in my file system. So if I click on this file and say, show it in Explorer, I can see that there's an additional file right next to it. So this is the original NEF file, which is my raw file that I captured, and then this is the XMP file, or the sidecar, that contains the changes to the image. Now, the important thing to understand here is that if I actually go to the Develop module here, and if I look at the history here, it's not going to preserve all the history. So if I make a bunch of changes to the image here, and whether I adjust the highlights or change the shadows, whatever changes that I make here, Lightroom is going to keep that as part of the history. But when I save the image in my metadata, if I go once again, Save Metadata File, that history doesn't get preserved. So what does this do? So if I selected all of these and press Control S, which will again save for 32,000 images, it's going to take a really long time to do it. Then if I were to say one day, you know what, I want to get rid of my Lightroom catalog and create a brand new one, if I re-import the images, every change that I made to those images is going to be preserved. So that's a nice benefit of this particular feature. And there is an option in Lightroom, if you go to Edit and click on Catalog Settings, you have the option right here that says automatically write changes into XMP. And as you can see, by default, it's not turned on, and I don't personally check this either. And the reason why is because I do not want Lightroom to make changes to my images every time I update the image. Now, another important thing to keep in mind is that if I actually have DNG files, if during the import you convert your images to DNG from your original RAW format, then it's not going to create a sidecar file when you press Control S. So just keep that in mind. And the reason why is because Lightroom is actually going to use the DNG header information to write those changes into those files. That's why you don't see the sidecar files, but the changes are still written into those DNG images. So to wrap up, you've got 3 additional backup options to consider. The first one is to consider backing up right in your camera. If you have a camera capable of doing 2 memory card slots and you can write to 2 memory card slots at the same time. The second one is to not overlook backing up the catalog files along with your photos. And the third one is at the end of the year or whenever you're done editing, especially when you do a lot of heavy editing, to make sure that you actually write the changes to the images. If you do these steps, it will potentially eliminate a lot of backup headaches because you're saving all this information.